Hello, BookTube. I'm here with a June on the Range video. I've been a bit remiss on my duties for as a co-host of June on the Range this year. The excuse is that I still have a lot of my books, or most of my books are still packed, and I can't locate the books that I wanted to read for this June on the Range. So it was a bit of a non starter for me, but I did find a few things at least one thing I've read so far, and I'm hoping to read a couple other things before the end of the month, fingers crossed. The book that I did find that I wanted to read this year is called Ride the Wind by Lucia St. Clair Robson. Now, this was published in 1982 by Random House, and this is a Ballantine paperback. It's quite big. It's a larger novel. It's 600 pages long, and it looks very much, as you can see there, like a romance. It's an interesting sort of wraparound, or the picture itself is quite interesting, but yeah, it has the sort of wrong look of what it should be. It says it's the story of Cynthia Ann Parker and the last days of the Comanche. Well, Cynthia Ann Parker was a young girl in 1836 living with her family in Texas, and they were raided. Their their homes. It was a an enclosure. They were raided by Comanches, and most of the family or the extended family was out in the fields. This is at the same time, basically, as you know, the Alamo was happening, and the fight with Mexico, Santa Anna, and so forth. But this was over, so they had come back. Actually, they had actually left their home, but then they came back, and yeah, the Comanche raided them and killed almost everybody that was left there. Took a number of women and the children, Cynthia Ann Parker and her brother John, I think it was, as well as a cousin of theirs she was a sort of mid teens. Now, there's after that, there's not a lot known of factual evidence of what happened to Cynthia Ann Parker, other than she stayed with the Comanche for a number of years, a number of decades, and it wasn't until I think 1870s that she was rescued, and I'll get to that in a moment as well. But at that point, she had a number of children with a Comanche warrior, and but when she was taken, she was sort of adopted into the Comanche tribe, and raised as a Comanche. And the sort of story, myth, legend that has sort of come down through her Comanche children's side is that she fell in love with when she became an adult or a late teenager, a Comanche brave, a Comanche warrior, and who became a chief. Now, that is the sort of myth that came through. As I say, there's not a lot that's known. She was rescued, liberated in the 1870s. She spent the rest of her life with her extended family, who was still alive. She never spoke about her experiences. She had a small daughter at the time, but the daughter had died in a year or so after she was with her extended family. She tried on a number of occasions to get back to the Comanche. Now, like I say, the Comanche side of the family, her son was Quanah Parker, who I'll get maybe to a little more about him in a bit, but he became sort of the last chief of the Comanche and was the last one to sort of surrender and work with the U.S. government to sort of salvage what could be salvaged of sort of the Comanche people. Now, it's, as I say, like there's not much known direct evidence for this. However, there are other stories that have been told by others that have been that were kidnapped and taken in by the Comanche. Now, the author here basically does two things. She takes the romanticized and mythical story that's been passed down and writes this in here, but also writes in maybe a more truthful side of how the kidnappees were treated. Because there was a cousin that Cynthia Ann Parker had. She was 9 years old, and her cousin was about 15 or 16. And in the story here, which is probably not far from the truth, that she was basically repeatedly, brutally raped in the camp, in the village, or the group that Cynthia Ann Parker was. Probably even saw this happening. She definitely saw her extended family, or the members of the family, being slaughtered at the enclosure where she was. That was pretty clear. So she probably was aware of what was happening to her cousin, tortured and repeatedly raped. Now, and the author very brutally and graphically describes all this. Graphically describes the brutality on both sides of the Comanche and the Texans, the whites, in this story. But as I say, she puts that with then this romanticization of Cynthia Ann Parker as she got older. But yeah, that's sort of the story, and it goes through her story of her being sort of, saved, if you want to call it that, rescued, and then a little bit. It continues on a little bit about Quanah Parker, her son, who takes control of the Comanche, and as he was sort of self proclaimed chief of the Comanche, and not all Comanche agreed with this. So but that's sort of reality, and that's shown in here as well. But yeah, it's as a book, as a story, as I say, like there's the first 100 pages or so is absolutely brutal, absolutely horrific. The descriptions that are in this. And then she sort of flips it on the other side and puts the romance in, and it just, as a story, it just doesn't quite work for me. Yeah, it's people like when I read reviews saying how great this is written and everything. It's like it's very faultily. There's lots of faults in it. There's inconsistencies where she starts going on one thing and then veers off and then leaves that hanging all the way through. It is that way, and it just seems that there's a lot of side issues and side stories that are almost like to fluff it out into a bigger story. I became interested in it because I am interested in Cynthia Ann Parker. My interest began basically by the 1950s John Ford film, The Searchers, which was based on Alan LeMay's novel, The Searchers, which was based on sort of Cynthia Ann Parker's story to a certain extent, and more about her uncle who spent a long time searching for her. Hence, The Searchers. They didn't go very far. Like it wasn't romanticized at all. in that story. Maybe a little heavy-handed on one side and than the other, but that's another discussion. Um, there are good things about this, I suppose. She deals with she raises things that a lot of times are not raised in westerns or people's concept of the West at this time. Basically, the with the West, like the guns are a big thing, obviously, and they always portray, and it's I believe the common belief is that the gun was mightier than anything else at the beginning, even of the 20th century, at frontier days. However, there's more reality to the fact that the guns that were used were not like guns of today. They were flintlocks, matchlocks, flintlocks, cap and ball, breech loading, muzzle loading, with a ball and having a cap at the end for an explosive cap and so forth. And these rifles were not that accurate, especially not over quite a big distance. And the fact is that the Native Indians' bow and arrow was much more accurate over a longer distance and silent. You shoot one gun off, everybody knows you're around. 1,000 arrows can be, well, I'm exaggerating there a little bit because there would be noise in 1,000 arrows, but number of arrows can be let loose and they're silent. And but as I say, the accuracy is better. And they had some really, really kind of high tech arrows at the time where, they instead of having the pointed this way, if they wanted to shoot somebody in the chest and get to their heart, they'd have the arrow this way, so it would slide through, and better chance of sliding through the ribs. Because otherwise, if it's this way, it would probably stick into the ribs. And then they also had arrows that I mean the points, the pointy bits that would go in, veer off, and break off. All these things. But anyway, it was an interesting thing that is not always discussed or talked about in westerns, and she touches on some of this material, which I found kind of interesting. And but anyway, it's just that like you always see in like the movies, like the gun is always mightier than the bow and arrow, but not really, especially early periods. When they got repeaters, that's a different matter. You know, and there were only a few weapons that were accurate at a long distance, and there weren't that many of them around, and it took a specialist or somebody well trained to use them at those distance. And most of the natives were very good at the bow and arrows. Anyway, it's an interesting story. As I say, I'm interested in Cynthia Ann Parker. There's a lot to unpack with this story. I'm glad I read it, and thanks to Summer at Sterling Reads, who made me aware of this book. I think it was last year. And as I say, I'm interested in her story and how it's been sort of, brought down and mythologized. She is, as a person, has been lost in the stories that have been told, sadly. But yeah, you know, um, and also this sort of, dispels the myth that all Native Indians were living peacefully with nature, and that Europeans came and were the brutal people, the brutality on both sides. There were some Indian groups that were peaceful and living very quiet lives, while others were bent on uh, domination, and like European countries, like countries throughout history. Um, So it's interesting, and it's nice to see a little bit of sort of, reality creeping in at times to some stories, rather than one side or the other. Like, usually you get, the native Indians, native North Americans are totally brutal, savage, and they should be wiped out. Or you got them that are they're peace loving and living with nature, and the Europeans wanted to wipe them all out. Neither one is true. There's a middle ground there, and there is, some, there's the truth is stranger than these fictions, to be honest. Anyway, I did enjoy this, but unless you're really up for something that is quite brutal, yeah, I would say, it's not a book for everybody. Let's put it that way. So yeah, well, thank you, BookTube. I hope to be back. I'm hoping to read. There's two Clifford Simak westerns, short stories that I need to read, and then I possibly might be reading a Zane Grey novel. The other material that I wanted to read, I can't find, so I'll have to wait till next year or another time. Thank you, BookTube.